Hello and welcome back to my retrospective on Metal Gear Ghost Babel. In the first part I've talked about the history of the Metal Gear series, the game's mechanics, and the overall gameplay. In this video I want to take a closer look at the game's story and the characters. And I also want to try to assess the game's overarching themes. Furthermore, I also have to address some of the game's problems, which unfortunately do exist. But first, I'll give you a summary of the plot. So without further ado, let's get started. And it goes without saying, spoilers ahead. If you just want to hear me discussing the game's issues and hear my overall verdict, skip to this timecode. As I mentioned in the first part of this retrospective, this game's story is set in an alternate timeline, so there are a lot of things happening and several revelations that contradict what we learn in other Metal Gear games. It begins with Snake's old friend Colonel Roy Campbell visiting him in his cottage in Alaska 7 years after the events of the original Metal Gear. Both Snake and Campbell have retired from the Special Forces Unit Foxhound several years ago, but Campbell returned for one last mission, for which he's trying to get Snake to join in as well. Mercenaries working for the Gindra Liberation Front, short GLF, have hijacked an American military plane that was carrying nuclear weapons and a new Metal Gear, and took the scientists, who were also on board, hostage. GLF, under the leadership of General Augustine Egwabon, want to use Metal Gear to win an ongoing civil war in the small Central African state of Gindra, and thus gaining sovereignty. Only after Campbell mentions that GLF's home base, Galloway, was formerly known as Outer Heaven, Snake is convinced to accept the mission to infiltrate the fortress, to rescue the scientists, and to neutralize Metal Gear. It was 7 years ago when Snake destroyed Metal Gear and killed his father Big Boss in Outer Heaven, which earned him the nickname The Legend. A title he really doesn't like, as according to him, that is a name given to a killer. Unfortunately for him, it's a term often used throughout the game. It becomes quite clear that these events from the past have left their mark on Snake, and he accepts the mission to find closure. Campbell also has personal reasons to take part in this mission, since he has his own demons to deal with. He's going to be the commanding officer for this mission and Snake's main contact. Furthermore, Snake's support team will also consist of Mei Ling, an MIT student who's designed the new radar system and codec that Snake is going to use, and who's also responsible for the mission log, aka saving the game. Brian McBride, CIA Director of Operations, who planned the mission and is an expert on Gindran affairs. And Ronald Lansenbrink, better known as Weasel, a mercenary who's got the reputation of being one of the best soldiers out there, on par with Snake himself, but deemed as trustworthy as a weasel, hence the nickname. He's an expert when it comes to other mercenaries, and according to intelligence, GLF have hired several top ones. There are two unseen characters who were also involved in the mission. Steve Gardner, the American National Security Advisor, will be in command of this operation, while John Parker, the American Chief of Staff, organized for a unit of Delta Force soldiers to be deployed in Galloway in order to support Snake. Neither of the two characters ever appear on screen, and are only talked about occasionally, but both play an integral part in the story. The next thing we see is Snake doing his halo jump, entering enemy territory, which is where the game starts. After Snake made his way through a short jungle section, he reaches the fortress's compound, where he receives distressing news. The Delta Force unit that Snake was supposed to be working with has been wiped out by the same group of mercenaries that also hijacked Metal Gear. There's only one survivor, Sergeant Chris Jenner, who contacts the team via codec and insists that she has to finish her mission no matter what. She's going to aid Snake on his mission. During the course of the game, Snake manages to free the last surviving researcher of Metal Gear's development team, Jimmy Harks, who informs Snake about Metal Gear's capabilities and that the US military planned to use it for Project Babel, a project of John Parker's. Furthermore, Snake has to confront the members of Black Chamber, the mercenary unit that hijacked Metal Gear and wiped out Delta Force. According to Chris, Black Chamber only has 4 members: Slasher Hawk, Marionette Owl, Pyro Bison, and the leader, Blackguard Viper. Black Chamber appear to have their own motivation to take part in all this, and have a score to settle with Foxhound. To stop a nuclear strike, Snake, shortly after he rescued Jimmy, makes his way to the maintenance base. However, he's intercepted by Viper, who's piloting an attack helicopter, and forces Snake to watch as Metal Gear launches a nuclear missile. It turns out, though, that the target was a nuclear testing site in Nevada, so there were no actual casualties. The general has sent a video message to the US president, telling him to remove all US troops from Gindran soil if he doesn't want the next target to be a major US city. After killing Hawk and Owl, Snake eventually fights and defeats Pyro Bison, who before killing himself with his own flamethrower, informs Snake that Black Chamber used to be a special forces unit working for the US government in Foxhound's shadow, and that they have a 5th member, who happens to be working as a mole in Snake's trusted circle. After Snake blows up the fortress's power plant to prevent a nuclear strike, he meets Jimmy again, who reveals that Chris was not the only surviving Delta Force member, and that she wasn't even with her unit when it was ambushed by Black Chamber, suspecting that she might be working with them. Sadly, their conversation is cut short, as Jimmy's handcuffs suddenly explode, killing him. Weasel states that this was most likely Viper's doing, as he's an expert in explosives and booby traps. On his way to the maintenance base where Metal Gear is stationed, Snake is attacked by the General's second-in-command, Sophie. He shoots down her helicopter, but ultimately spares her alive. Inside the maintenance base, Snake is confronted by Viper, who's captured Chris and reveals to Snake that 2 years ago, Black Chamber were given the mission to recover Metal Gear, which was hijacked by terrorists in South America. They succeeded in destroying the bipedal tank despite suffering losses, but once they returned home, they were ambushed by Foxhound and almost completely eradicated. The order was given by someone only referred to as Anonymous. Merely 5 members of Black Chamber survived the attack, and they swore revenge on Anonymous and started working with GLF and the General in order to reach that goal. It comes to a fight between the two men, and Snake once more emerges victorious and frees Chris. She admits that she's been given special orders by John Parker to destroy all information on Project Babel, Metal Gear, and the General's planned assassination. He was supposed to be eliminated to ensure his silence in case he gets captured. Snake sends Chris on her way to find an escape vehicle for once Snake has completed his mission. He finally finds Metal Gear, which is controlled by the General himself, who promises Snake that if he manages to defeat Metal Gear, he'll tell him what he knows about Black Chamber and Project Babel. After a tough battle, Snake manages to destroy Metal Gear. The General, mortally wounded in the process, sticks to his word and explains everything shortly before he dies, and also gives him a data disk containing proof and every info about Project Babel. After the General's death, Viper, having survived their previous encounter, suddenly appears on top of the destroyed Metal Gear, telling Snake that it was Colonel Campbell who was in charge of the attack that fateful night when Foxhound murdered the members of Black Chamber. He then activates both Metal Gear and the lift that they're on. Once it reaches the surface, Metal Gear would send a signal to several satellites in orbit that are equipped with nuclear bombs, in order to perform a large nuclear attack, as a declaration of war against Anonymous. A codec call reveals that Brian McBride and Snake's support team is the 5th Black Chamber operative, and he's holding the Colonel, Mei Ling, and Weasel at gunpoint. It comes to a final duel between Snake and Viper, and Snake only has 90 seconds to defeat his adversary. He manages to do so in time and deactivates Metal Gear's signal. As the lift reaches the surface, Sophie reappears and tells Snake that she's going to lead GLF from now on, and that she will continue the General's fight in hopes of building a free country. Just as Sophie is about to be on her way, Chris shows up in a jeep to pick up Snake and get out of Gallowade. Suddenly, the codec rings again. Weasel has killed McBride, and it comes to some final revelations. Campbell admits that he was in charge of killing Black Chamber, but that he was unaware he'd be attacking a US unit, as he's been ordered to wipe out a group of terrorists, which is also the reason why he retired. It turns out that Steve Gardner, the National Security Advisor and the man who is in charge of the entire operation, was Anonymous all along. Everything that happened was basically because of a rivalry between Parker and Gardner, as both of them wanted to be in charge of Project Babel. Weasel, being the only mercenary skilled enough to best the legend Solid Snake, was hired by Gardner to silence Snake's team and ultimately kill Snake himself at the end of the operation. But before things turn bad, he admits that he grew fond of them and lets them go, willing to face the consequences for doing so. Chris and Snake then drive off into the sunset. Snake, who's found a new will to live, says that he wants to get back to the US to bring both Parker and Gardner to justice for playing chess with people's lives and their hearts. He then asks her if she's going to wait for him, to which she says that he can count on it. So that's a summary of the plot. A lot of details about the unseen characters Parker and Gardner are only revealed in the postgame, what their motivation for things are, what sparked their rivalry, and also some more info about Project Babel. Now, what exactly is this Project Babel? And what's the deal with Gardner and Parker? The General, before his death, provides you with a huge info dump, and he explains things as follows. It turns out that Gardner was the one who organized Outer Heaven and the development of the original Metal Gear. Outer Heaven used to be a venture backed and financed by the US, and the idea was to use it to provide mercenaries to clients in a way to check out anti-American forces. But Big Boss didn't comply, and made Outer Heaven his own. In order to hide any sort of connection between the US and Outer Heaven, the government created a hero myth, using Snake to bring down Outer Heaven and making him the legend. This caused Foxhound to become too famous, which is why Black Chamber was founded in the first place. They performed the dirty tasks Foxhound would usually do, but now couldn't, due to them being in the eyes of the general populace. Parker came up with Project Babel, GLF was secretly backed by the US in order to fight anti-American forces in Africa. Their purpose was basically to provoke tribes and neighboring nations into a conflict and create a climate of hostility, to ensure there wouldn't be any alliances, so that the US could send peacekeeping troops to exercise control over the region. This was to ensure that the US would be the sole superpower reigning over manageable chaos, an artificial Babel, hence the name. When you beat certain missions in special mode, you get the info from the mysterious character only known as Number 4, that the general actually used to be a disciple of Big Boss. This is probably why Parker chose him to be the field controller for this entire thing, but well, in the end the general had his own ideas. It was Chris's job to destroy any evidence of Project Babel and any connection between Parker and GLF. The general has always been aware of Viper's intentions to use GLF and Metal Gear to exact their revenge on Anonymous, aka Gardner, but he used this to his own advantage. At some point in time he was romantically involved with his second-in-command, Sophie, who was unaware of the general's original allegiance with the United States, and followed him because she actually believed in his ideals. It's the ideals of Gindra being a free country that drive her to lead GLF after the general's death. If you're a veteran of the series, you probably have noticed that Ghost Babel's plot follows the same blueprint as Metal Gear Solid on the PlayStation 1. Campbell coming to Alaska to pull Snake out of retirement, Mei Ling being in charge of saving the game, a female sidekick and potential love interest, dressed as an enemy soldier who gets captured at some point, a young scientist, Campbell withholding information about something, the big bad having a personal grudge against Snake, an enemy mercenary unit whose members have animal names, a shadowy figure in the US government who serves as a secret antagonist. This is most likely intentional, I suppose because Konami originally wanted this game to be a port of Metal Gear Solid. So keeping some of the basic structure and character dynamics makes sense, but I think that this game has enough individual aspects that allow it to be its own thing. I'd even go as far to say that the Snake we see in this game is actually a bit different from his PlayStation counterpart. While the Snake we see on PlayStation is very reminiscent of the cool action hero archetype, who doesn't shy away from flirting with female team members, and seems very hardened by the events that happened in his life up to this point, the Snake presented in Ghost Babel feels more down to earth. He also seems more grumpy rather than cool, and sometimes downright awkward. Compare him flirting with Meryl or Mei Ling in Metal Gear Solid with the self-confidence of a young Kurt Russell.
I just didn't expect a world-class designer of military technology to be so cute.
You're just flattering me.
No, I'm serious. Well, I know I won't be bored for the next 18 hours.
To this scene here when he meets Chris for the first time. He just looks at her in a weird way and says, "Sorry, you are just better looking than most soldiers I have to deal with," which is his idea of a compliment. And then he moves on to the pressing issues immediately. A more human aspect of his is revealed after the battle with Bison, the third boss of the game. He confronts Snake with his sins, and accuses him of accepting this mission because he wants the glory, that he wants to be the legend, and that he enjoys being center stage, and that he keeps killing for it, because that is the only thing he's good at. He confirms this later in an optional dialogue with Chris. The other iteration of Snake appears to be standing above such things as fame and glory. Ghost Babel Snake, however, actually enjoyed his fame and being called a hero. He enjoyed being the legend. He's struggling to admit it because he knows the reasons for his fame are nothing to be proud of. He's killed people, and among those people was his own father, even though he only learned about that later. Furthermore, he's suffering from heavy depression thanks to all this. He himself says that he can't live with his actions, and that he probably shouldn't even be alive, and that the only reason why he returned to Outer Heaven was because he hoped that someone would end his life, at the place where his own bloody journey began. It is thanks to Chris in the end that Snake manages to forgive himself and to find the strength and will to continue on living. Chris Jenner serves as a counterpart to Meryl from Metal Gear Solid. She's a trained Delta Force soldier with a troubled background, who actually acts quite competently throughout most of the game. Until she gets captured. Being under Parker's direct command, she basically is also following her own objectives, outside of helping Snake. Ultimately, she serves as an anchor towards Snake. In contrast to Meryl, who's quite a memorable character, Chris unfortunately feels a bit bland. But that doesn't mean she's unlikable. She's alright. The rest of the characters are also alright. Some of them feel a bit one-note, but others even have an arc. Calling your teammates via codec is always interesting, because you get optional dialogue, where they reveal more about themselves, like Weasel telling his backstory of how his actions led to his brother's death. And talking to Mei Ling is always fun, because she always has a brainy quote to share, just like in Metal Gear Solid. I'd say the characters that stand out most to me, other than Snake, are Jimmy and Viper. Jimmy, the head of the Metal Gear development team, starts off as a bratty, arrogant kid who considers Metal Gear to be his masterpiece and proof of his genius, despite it being a weapon of mass destruction. Snake first meets him when he's locked up in his cell in the barracks, where he does pretty much nothing but nag Snake. After breaking him out, Snake gets to chat with him. He seems rather unfazed by the events, or the deaths of his co-workers, and states that he doesn't care what Metal Gear is being used for, and that he just wants to be wherever his talents can be used the best. While Snake is about to free him, the power suddenly goes out, and Snake leaves him in Chris's capable hands, as a power outage can only mean that they're powering up Metal Gear's railgun. She confirms later via codec that Jimmy's in fact a pain in the butt. They eventually get separated, and Jimmy's recaptured. After Snake blows up the power plant to prevent a nuclear strike, he finds Jimmy again, standing next to the body of a Delta Force soldier who took a bullet shielding Jimmy. This is where Jimmy starts showing remorse for his actions and for building Metal Gear. He tells Snake that he saw the bodies of the other scientists, who were all still alive and working with him the day before, which must have been quite traumatizing and probably awakened something in him. Desperate, he asks Snake if it's possible to start new, to which he replies that it's never too late for that. Wanting to correct the error of his ways, Jimmy hopes that once he returns to the United States, that he can use his skills for the benefit of mankind and make up for Metal Gear. Unfortunately though, he doesn't get the chance to do that, as the handcuffs he's wearing have been booby-trapped by Blackguard Viper, who detonates them remotely, killing Jimmy. But to move on to something a little more lighthearted, probably the funniest scene in the game, which is actually one of my favorite scenes in any game, involves Jimmy. When you first meet him, he'd tell you how to get him out of his cell by blowing up the eastern wall with C4. However, you can skip that entire first meeting and just grab some C4 without talking to him first, and then blow up the wall, which leads to this amazing moment. 20 years later, and it still cracks me up. Viper is a pretty good villain in my opinion. He gets stuff done, and most of his plans actually work out. He kills one of your allies, he captures Chris. He gets involved with GLF just to uncover Anonymous's identity, which he even manages to do in the end. When you encounter the other members of Black Chamber, they show nothing but reverence for him. Before Black Chamber, they were alone and had nowhere to go, and Viper basically gave them a family. He lost his left arm in the ambush 2 years ago and now wears a prosthetic one. According to Owl, he rarely wears it though, because looking at his stump reminds him of his dead comrades, which gives him the strength to continue. Weasel mentions in an optional codec call that it's a miracle that Viper is still breathing, since the injuries he suffered were almost fatal, and it's only his lust for vengeance that keeps him alive. After his final defeat, he asks Snake how he manages to continue fighting and living, and then apologizes to his friends for not being able to avenge their deaths, which makes him kinda sympathetic in my opinion. Okay, now that we know the plot and learned some things about the characters, I'd like to get into the game's theme. However, I quickly want to address the popular theory that the entire game was a simulation that Metal Gear Solid 2's protagonist Raiden was going through as some sort of training exercise. I don't think this theory makes sense in the context of the game. It's true that after completing every special mission, number 4 will address the player as Jack, which is Raiden's actual name. However, number 4 mentions in the beginning of the special missions that all the things we see in-game actually happened to Snake. Since everything points to this game being set in an alternate timeline, I think it's best to either treat it as an Easter egg, a meta-teaser for Metal Gear Solid 2, or a potential teaser for a sequel to Ghost Babel that could have shown a version of Raiden from this timeline. Unfortunately, chances of a sequel ever seeing the light of day are pretty much non-existent, so there's that. Moving on. Most of the canonical games in the Metal Gear series have an overarching theme, which is heavily reflected in the game's plot and story, and which usually comes to a conclusion by the end. For example, in Metal Gear Solid on the PlayStation, the theme is Gene, and the story is all about how our genes may or may not define who we are. When it comes to Ghost Babel, it's a little difficult to tell if there actually is one definite term that can summarize the entire game. I've been giving it a lot of thought, and I think I found 2 sets of themes that are interwoven and prevalent in the game's story that also drive the plot and the characters. The first one being sin and guilt, and the second one being ideals and purpose. The problem with these, though, is that those themes are pretty much featured in every Metal Gear game, so I'm going to try and determine if one of these can be seen as the main theme overall. So let's have a look and go through several of the characters and see which themes are reflected by their actions. Snake and Campbell both retired out of guilt for their doings, both having committed sins in the past. Snake of course having killed a lot of people, his father among them, and Campbell having taken part in the massacre of Black Chamber. It's their guilt that drove them to go on this mission in the first place. Snake returned to Outer Heaven in hopes that someone would kill him. But once he uncovered the truth about the shadowy figures that play with human lives, he found a new purpose and ideals that helped him keep going in the end. Viper's purpose and his ideals were what kept him going as well, despite the injuries that should have killed him 2 years ago. He wanted to punish Gardner, and thought that there are no innocents in a society of people who just want to believe every lie that they are told. According to him, this is what allows individuals like Gardner to exist in the first place. In Viper's eyes, this blissful ignorance and complacency makes every normal citizen in the US complicit, and thus sinners. The members of Black Chamber were outcasts until Viper took them in, and gave them purpose and ideals to live and fight for. Marionette Owl even mentioned that Viper has forgiven him his sins when he recruited him. Pyro Bison was using the term sin a lot, and confronted both Snake and in a meta way the player with their sins, accusing Snake of wanting fame and being ready to kill for it, and mentioning the amount of people that the player has killed during this mission already. Jimmy, who's been acting for selfish reasons, without regard for other people's lives, was lacking ideals. Ultimately was struck by guilt when he realized the consequences of his own actions, his sin being Metal Gear. This helped him find a new purpose and a new ideal, to work for the good of mankind. This somewhat reflects Snake's journey as well, and might have helped Snake realize that he too can find forgiveness and a reason to live. The General has been deceiving both the US and GLF in order to follow his ideals. And as Sophie says in the end, his ideals may have been faked, but they're not empty. Chris's ideals were what allowed Parker to manipulate her into getting rid of evidence that could incriminate several members of the US government. Whatever she did was because she thought blindly following orders would be the best thing for her country, but she chose to ignore how questionable these orders might be. It seems to me that the ideals and goals by the characters all trace back to sins, either committed by themselves or by others. So what can we take away from all this? My take on it is that the ending offers something similar to Metal Gear Solid's gene message, which basically gives a positive outlook on how we don't have to let our genes define who we are. Instead of genes, we can apply this to our sins and our guilt, as the sins of the past are what drive and motivate the protagonist and several other characters in the game's story. I would conclude that the game's theme is sin, which fits in nicely with all the other one-syllable themes as well. Viper, unable to forgive the sins of Fox Sound and Anonymous, was willing to commit even more sins to quench his thirst for vengeance, which ultimately led to his demise and that of his followers. In contrast, Snake learned by the end of the story that we can't let our past actions control our future, and instead we should be able to forgive ourselves and find something that helps us make up for our sins, and ultimately work to make the world a better place. But what do you think? Does this make sense? What else could be the game's theme? Or is it possible that there is no theme at all? Let me know in the comments. Alright, I think I talked enough about the story and the positive, and it probably has become quite apparent that I'm kinda fond of this game. However, it has flaws, and I just can't turn a blind eye on those because of my love for it. Some flaws are minor and forgivable, while others can have a negative impact on the overall experience. So let's start with the small ones, and work our way up to the bigger problems. As an example, a very small issue, some of the proportions seem a bit out of whack. Like the trucks are way bigger on the inside than on the outside. Big deal, whatever. Slightly bigger one, the level architecture sometimes feels weird and inorganic, and that is something I personally find distracting, because my brain is trying to make sense of it, even though there probably is none. In Metal Gear Solid, every location in the nuclear weapons disposal facility has a purpose. They feel like proper realistic locations and rooms that you would find at such a place. Compare that to this level in Ghost Babel, which is referred to as a watchtower. Now, I'm not an expert when it comes to military facilities, but what kind of watchtower is built like this? It might actually be a translation error, because looking at the Japanese version, this facility is merely referred to as tatemono, which is a generic term for building. A watchtower is never mentioned as far as I can see. Maybe it's supposed to be this place here? Who knows? It never becomes quite clear if this is an actual part of the fortress that you get to see in-game, but I assume this is what it is. And what are these rooms for? Who designed this thing? What is its purpose? One annoying thing, you keep having to select the damn key cards to open security doors. Couldn't that just have been like an automatic thing? An even more annoying thing, you can't skip cutscenes or codec conversations. That becomes quite noticeable when replaying the game, because some of them go on for quite a bit, even if you can't skip through individual dialogue strings. It's especially frustrating when you play the special missions where they still give you the cutscenes from the main game. They should have just cut those. I'm not a fan of those infrared sensors either. They slow down gameplay quite a bit, and having to wait for them to appear and disappear sometimes feels like they're just trolling you. The way the game grades your performance at the end of each stage feels inconsistent. Supposedly the result is based on a combination of speed, amount of times you have been spotted, how many enemies you have killed, and how many healing items you have used. However, I feel that speed is the most governing factor in all this, which kinda discourages you from exploring the levels. And sometimes just running through the levels like a madman, getting discovered around every corner, gives you a better ranking than by being an invisible, yet somewhat slow ghost. And that kinda goes against the concept of the game in my opinion. One big flaw is that you cannot delete the game's save data. Once you unlocked everything, it's impossible to reset your progress and start again from scratch. And remember how I mentioned earlier how after the special missions you would get additional info on the game's backstory and John Parker and Steve Gardner? Well, you better pay attention to those, because you get them once, you're never gonna get them again. And that's a real shame, and a baffling decision on the developer's side. But by far the biggest problem that I've hinted at in my previous video, the barracks. Everything concerning those damn conveyor belts. This is the stage where you have to find and rescue Jimmy. It has 3 floors: the ground floor, the basement, and the first floor, which contains the stage's gimmick conveyor belts and color sorting machines that transport boxes to different parts of the stage. The idea is to use the different colored cardboard boxes to get to different areas and find new items, but this entire sequence is the most convoluted and frustrating thing in the entire game. Not only are you not quite sure on what to do and where to go, but most of the time you just end up in the heavily guarded basement area, over and over again. And you have to make your way back up to the first floor, over and over again. Just so you select the wrong path and get punished by going back to the basement. I mean, the beginning feels okay. You only have the yellow box, and only using that one allows you to get the red one. But then you have to start switching between them. And every time you get to a fork, you wonder, oh crap, should I change it? Or should I just keep going with the one I have right now? I suppose you can sorta use some weird logic and vaguely figure out that some belts lead into rooms or to areas off screen, while the places you don't want to go all have a drop-off point in that large area here? This is extremely hard to figure out. And unforgiving as hell. And it's all accompanied by this music. It's burned into my brain. And the stage just goes on and on and on. And once you've acquired certain items, you even have to backtrack to places you've been before. It's traumatizing. To this day I get PTSD whenever I see a conveyor belt, and even grocery shopping turns into a nightmare. So if you want to play the game, I suggest you use a guide for this particular area. Luckily, I had a video game magazine when I was a kid that happened to have a walkthrough for that entire conveyor belt section, so I managed to beat that level in the end. Oh, I almost forgot. There's also one additional problem. If you want to play this game legally, good luck with that. It has gotten extremely rare, and the prices for even just a used cartridge are extremely high. And considering it's a Konami game, it is more likely we're going to have a pachinko remake of this game before we get to see a digital version. If you happen to get your hands on a cartridge, I'd recommend playing on a Game Boy Advance SP. It has a bigger screen and it's also backlit. It's a neat little device. Replaying it after almost 2 decades, I still think that Ghost Babel is an amazing game. And although I consider Metal Gear Solid 1 to be one of my favorite games of all time, I think I have to say that Ghost Babel has actually aged a bit better, in some regards. When you look at MGS1, obviously the PS1 graphics aren't exactly pretty by today's standards, but also the controls feel quite a bit awkward nowadays. As an example, simply running to a guard and trying to grab him feels very imprecise. You are always either too far away or you run into them, triggering the alarm. And when it comes to the other 2D Metal Gear games, Ghost Babel has the benefit of being made in the late 90s and being able to borrow more modern gameplay elements, including from MGS. And also in terms of controls, enemy behavior, animation, general gameplay loop, and narrative, it holds up better by comparison. Since it's more grounded and pretty straightforward, and the cutscenes aren't as long as in any of the 3D Metal Gears, I'd almost go as far and say that it's the best gateway into that strange thing that's the Metal Gear universe, even if it's set in an alternate timeline, from a story point of view. If you never played a Metal Gear before, and you enjoy older 2D games, it might be worth checking out. And if you're a Metal Gear veteran, and you were unaware of this game altogether, then I assume you can already tell by watching this video if you're going to like it or not. It might not be as intricate or profound as the main entries in the series, but in the grand scheme of things, I think it's one of the best games on the system, and a truly overlooked classic. Now, I'd be interested to know, what is your favorite Metal Gear? Have you played the game? Are you interested in playing it? And what are your general opinions on the game? Please, leave a comment. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please consider leaving a like. And if you want to hear me talk more about video games, why don't you subscribe to my channel? Thanks, and I hope you have a lovely day.